5 years ago I was talking about binocular coordination in reading, that I probably won't forget very soon. And so what I'm going to do today is presenting research I've been doing ever since on scene perception. And I've been told that most of you will know the basics of eye movements. I will, gloss over it a little bit at the beginning. But if you have any questions, just feel free to ask in between, because otherwise, if I lose you at the very beginning, then there's, that would be bad. So there's a rich literature on reporting basic research on visual attention and search, and this research has been most informative, but there are two quite fundamental problems. First of all, the stimuli are not ecologically valid, and secondly, it is unclear to what degree findings were generalized if more ecologically valid stimuli were used. For example, natural scenes. And in most instances, this research is also conducted in the laboratory, and it's based on the simplifying assumption that depictions are reasonable substitutes for real-world scenes. And we can use line drawings, computer-generated scenes, kind of photographs of real scenes, or dynamic scenes. Okay? And right, so this is my kind of basic slide. So we typically explore a scene through eye movements, and eye guidance in scenes has a spatial aspect described by the positions of fixations and a temporal aspect described by the fixation durations. And the picture here displays part of the scenes participants may look at, and for one person the gaze trace is superimposed, and the red lines are the eye movements or saccades, and they move the eyes to a different location, and the yellow circles are display the fixations during which the eyes remain relatively still and visual and higher level processing can take place, right? So, and the logic we're working with in our field, and that's not very important, is that the fixation durations are sensitive to processing demands, whereas the fixation locations are an indicator of where people attend to in the scene. Right. And in the first part of my talk, I'm going to focus on visual motor aspects of scene perception. So let me remind you briefly why we have to move our eyes all the time, and that's because of visual acuity limitations. So visual acuity is best in the fovea, the sentinel, say 2 degrees of vision, and with increasing eccentricity, that means distance from the fovea, visual acuity strongly decreases. So it's not as good in the parafovea, and it's even poorer in the periphery. So in that schematic depiction, that would be the periphery. And therefore, we move our eyes to place the fovea on that part of the scene or stimulus we want to see clearly. And with regard to terminology, vision researchers oftentimes refer to the fovea and the parafovea, so those two regions together, as central vision. So that's going to be important later on. So the first very basic question I was asking is, from how large a region around the current point of gaze people can take in kind of useful information, and put differently, how large is the perceptual or visual span? And that's a question that's very well investigated in reading, but not so much in scene perception. And now the size of the span can be measured by using the moving window paradigm, and it works like that. So the idea is to degrade scene information outside of the window that moves in close to real time with your eyes. And here I've used a really strong low-pass filter that removed any details about objects in the scene. So, and I varied the size of the window here experimentally, in a fine-grained manner. Here it's in steps of 1 degree, so at that kind of viewing distance, the width of my thumb would be about 1 degree, to determine, and that's the logic now, to determine the smallest window that does not interfere with task performance. And in this study, I've been using a scene search task, so participants were asked to look for a particular object in the scene. It was indicated by a verbal cue. And this demo here visualizes the extreme condition in which the high resolution information is restricted to a really small window which really only approximates the size of the fovea. And a lot of times observers could not do the task in this condition. And here are the search times plotted as a function of the window radius, and the horizontal lines, those are data from 2 experiments, depict the data from the known window control condition, right? And again, we define the visual span as the moving window size at which search times become indistinguishable from the control condition. And that happened at only at 8 degrees only, which was a bit of an unexpected finding. So the visual span is quite large, and if you map this back to the size of the scene, in those conditions here at least, 8 degrees to either side of fixation captures 44% of the entire scene surface. And you'll learn later on why I was actually interested in that. So, and the data now also speak to the question whether foveal vision, the 1 degree condition, or central vision, the 5 degree condition, are sufficient to do the task. And that's not the case because in both conditions we observe search time costs, right? So if I give you central vision only, that's not sufficient to emulate normal search performance. I think that's a wording one of the reviewers told me to, or specified that's the right way of phrasing it. So thanks for that. So in a second study, I've kind of replicated that and then asked the inverse question. So are foveal or central vision necessary to obtain normal search performance? And now, this time I don't create those little spotlights through which you would observe or view the scene, but I create blind spots. That is, I degrade your foveal or central vision in this condition here. And that's a demo. So you're supposed to look for the funnel. And again, I use a strong low-pass filter and like Gaussian mask so that there aren't any edges. And that's all kind of slowed down a little, and they eventually get to the funnel in the upper left, right. And this graph shows the reaction times or search times as a function of the blind spot or scotoma, because it's kind of simulating a clinical condition where you don't have foveal or central vision. And for the foveal blind spot, this one here, the average search time is not prolonged. So, which implies that foveal vision is not necessary, right? And only for the largest blind spot, knocking out central vision, that is foveal and peripheral vision, 5 degrees, we observe search time costs. And that, actually was an unexpected finding, and I zoom in into this a little more very soon. So because now the neat thing about the eye movements, eye movement data is that they allow us to kind of pinpoint to a certain degree where in the search process these costs originate, the costs we observed for the central vision condition. So specifically, we can now kind of decompose the behavioral measure, the search time, into 3 behavioral epochs based on the eye movement data. So search initiation time is the time between the onset of the scene and your very first eye movement. So it's basically initial saccade latency, if you want. And then scanning time is the time from the first saccade to your first fixation on the target, right? And it reflects the actual search process. And then verification time is the time between then and search termination. So a lot of times you would press a button.
So Antje, what if they looked at it and they didn't get it? Like for instance, the funnel was a very good example in the sense that, funnels can be different shape, different size, so you can imagine that they didn't get it at the first time because they were a bit too fast. See what I mean? So you look at it, but you didn't realize that that's the funnel. It's only when you do read.
Right, so the question is whether I excluded cases where they, basically accidentally.
Yeah. Didn't get it. That I'm actually.
You would do that for non-Scotoma tasks, but in this task I didn't do that. So the first encounter with the object would kind of define the scanning task, and everything else would then kind of add up to verification time. And that has something to do with strategies I will present you in a minute. That what's special about this task is that as soon as you jump towards the object, it disappears under the Scotoma. So it's hard to then verify that. But I'll clarify that in a minute, because those are the data. And again, the interesting condition is actually that one here, the large blind spot, where we observe the search time pass. And now, interestingly, the search initiation time and the scanning time were not affected. And that means, and I really like this, that means the objects could be localized in the periphery as good as in the control condition. However, it took longer to verify their identity. And this is actually nicely presented in our example trial, because so what drives those verification times up? So imagine you locate a likely target candidate in peripheral vision, then you're programming your eye movement towards it, and for the the super expert amongst you, you even show a preferred viewing location on that object despite having a scotoma, because you targeted in peripheral vision, so very beautiful. But once you land on the objects, it's masked by the blind spot. So oftentimes observers kind of move away from the object once again to further analyze it in peripheral vision before terminating search. And I spent a lot of time on this data trying to find out whether they kind of learned stuff or developed strategies, but they didn't. So they basically behaved as they would do a normal search. And then when they realized, I don't actually see anything anymore, they would go back every once in a while. So a good strategy would be, just analyze it in peripheral vision and then make your last terminating fixation, but they didn't do that. Right, so now why are these findings important? Well, first of all, they provide benchmark data for such models, because there are now quite a few of them around, also accommodating realistic objects and scenes, but all of them except for one by Greg Zielinski basically neglect the limitations imposed by visual acuity. And then perhaps more importantly, these results also demonstrate that findings obtained with highly artificial search displays do not necessarily generalize when more realistic stimuli are used. So to give you an example, so in a well-cited study, a subject searched a display consisting of letters and numbers, and the task was to find the letter Y here. And a gaze continued masking technique was used to simulate a foveal scotoma, and specifically the fixated element and all characters falling within the foveal region here in red were replaced by plus signs. And with a foveal scotoma, it took longer to find the target, which indicated, foveal vision is necessary. That's what every review paper was going to tell you. And remember, I found that foveal vision was not necessary. Even central vision was, not necessary to locate the target. So how can we kind of reconcile this? Well, some of you will probably have a good guess of why this is the case. So first of all, you can argue, this does not approximate how we search in the real world. And it's actually more similar to reading this task, because you need here the high spatial frequency information, which is removed by this scotoma, to discriminate the letters and digits, which you don't necessarily need to search for a medium-sized object in a real-world scene. Though of course I could create search conditions with scenes where, I would find different things if I superimpose the famous TRL on a scene, or make the objects really small, or make sure they don't, they have a poor contrast. So I'm sure I could create conditions where I would find.
So would you predict then, so we're talking now about fine-grained detail, right?
Yeah.
The why.
The high street.
Would you predict that as you blow up the letters that it would start behaving more like your stuff you see with the scene, that they can do it in peripheral vision?
That's what you would, that's a prediction, yeah. So that's what Sebastian related, right, in his study where magnifying letters, that would be a prediction, yeah. And that's also, there's a clinical condition, macular degeneration, and I have a friend who has a juvenile version of it, and she can so her behavior confirms everything I find in my, stupid experiments. She can navigate perfectly well, find objects, but she can't read. So she has a fancy device that photographs the paper. She's actually a scientist. Photographs the paper and then blows it up to that size. Then she can select a good contrast, and then she can read. So yeah, that's how it works. Because she can only read with peripheral vision, which is quite a hard task, but it's possible. So right. So that's a brief interim summary. So the visual span is large. Foveal vision is neither sufficient nor necessary to achieve normal search performance, and central vision is not necessary to locate the target, but it aids verification. Right, so that was the first part about the visual motor aspects, and if we now zoom out a little, the kind of complex eye movement patterns in scene view can be represented simply as a series of individual decisions about where and when to move the eye. So that's how I like to think about it. So as for the where to go next, the fixation positions, there's a lot of empirical and computational research, also from computer vision science, and in comparison, less work has been done on the when decision, the temporal aspect, covering fixation durations. So I'm going to gloss over some research on the where fairly quickly, so it's really just a pointer. So again, the question is where and how is visual attention allocated in scenes, and the dominant idea here comes from computer vision and neuroscience, advocating image-based attention selection, so suggesting that we process each scene for its low-level features at multiple scales, specifically intensity, orientation, and color, and this is then combined into a saliency map, and this whole family of saliency models, there are really tons of them around, shares the idea that visual differences are informative or potentially informative, and they attract our attention and gaze, right? And then, right, so here I'm in the cognitive psychology department, so I can ask this kind of slightly provocative questions. Are we really stimulus-driven saliency detectors? And of course, it's not the whole story. And as a kind of cognitive alternative, if you want, we can propose that we select objects. It's also, an intuitive explanation. And I have tested those two alternatives, so object-based versus image-based selection, using eye movement data. And so my friends in informatics, world-class informatics in Edinburgh, are still not able to segment scenes into objects. So a student had to tag the objects in the scenes. And we had about 730 objects tagged in more than 100 scenes. And the idea was to analyze the distribution of the eye fixations within those scenes. So I do accept, or I expect that you would look at those objects, and then I analyze where you look, and the results show a clear hotspot towards the center of the object, right? And underlying is, with a little bit of fantasy, a two-dimensional Gaussian distribution, right? And the interpretation of this finding is actually derived from basic ocular research and also reading research. So, and it goes like that. That's really a very brief story. So viewers did select those objects, and with their eye movements, and the intended location location is the center of the object, because that's, supposed to be the optimal viewing position. And most eye movements go there. That's what the hotspot shows us. But there's also, oculomotor error, which leads to the observed variance. So far so good. So, and this basic phenomenon of, we call this the preferred viewing location, can be summarized such that objects are important, or play an important role in attention allocation / saccade targeting in scenes. I'm not saying we only ever look at objects, because of course that's also not true. And now the question still remains why saliency models have some predictive power, right? And briefly, this is through a correlation between the objects and what's called the saliency proto-object. And using the method I've briefly introduced here, I attempted to take out that correlation. And once you do that, any systematic relationship disappears. So the PBL here then disappears, right? So yeah, so that's like a very brief story about this type of research. But this is a little older, so I wanted to present to you some very recent research on the where, and that's looking from that looking at that question from a slightly different angle. And that is, yeah?
Just out of curiosity, how did you decorrelate the two? Did you do things like reduce the contrast, or?
No. So I used a version of the saliency model that produced those proto-objects, those here, and then I put my box around those, and then I analyzed where do people land or fixate in those proto-objects.
Okay.
And basically the idea is, if you select the objects, PBL for the objects, if you select the proto-objects,
No PBL.
no PBL with the proto-objects, and then what you see here in the icon, there's a bit of a PBL first, but that's due to the fact that some proto-objects overlap with the objects, and that's where the correlation comes in.
Okay.
If I then only analyze the saliency objects that do not overlap, then it disappears, right? That next icon. So, and the computer vision people didn't quite like that. So if I look at the citations I get for this work, it's like, now we're getting better saliency models with better proto-objects. Like, that's still not quite the point, but thanks for citing me. So, yeah. Right. And so this is now a question which is, at least my university, that's a lot more appealing because it has some kind of neuropsychological background at first sight, at least. So it's, but you're all in the cognitive group, so I don't need to, Anyway, so that's, so the question is, are there any spatial biases with regard to where people attend to in a scene? And the specific phenomenon we've investigated is a left bias known as student neglect. And let me explain this by using the line bisection task here, in which you would be asked to select the middle point of a horizontal line. And patients suffering from visual spatial neglect show a rightward bias in that task. And now, interestingly, healthy people show a smaller bias in the opposite direction, which is sometimes referred to as student neglect. And we wanted to look at this in the context of scene viewing, and in a typical scene viewing experiment, observers initially fixate the center of the scene, from which, in theory, they could go anywhere, right, left or right. And however, there are at least 2 studies reporting that the first saccade in a scene more often goes to the left side than to the right side of the image, so it's about 60 to 40%. And however, scene exploration is an active and dynamic process which extends beyond the first saccade. So we wanted to look at the time course of any leftward bias. Is it a short-lived phenomenon? Is it a longer-lasting one? And in order to measure that or to quantify that, we analyzed horizontal fixation positions, like those two here, as the deviations from the vertical midline of the image, right? So a fixation on the right side of the image would get a positive deviation, a fixation on the left side of the image a negative one, and a mean fixation deviation, a mean negative fixation deviation would be indicative of a leftward bias, right? And in addition, we investigated how student neglect depends on task-related control. That's, was a little bit of a speculative part of the project. We used 3 different viewing tasks that varied in the degree of kind of top-down control they typically evoke. So in the preference judgment task, participants were basically free to inspect the scene as they liked, so there was little to no task-imposed top-down control. And the other extreme is the scene search task, so I, as experimenter, tell you exactly what to do, right? And to search for an object, and that's primarily or very much top-down control. And the memorization task is somewhere in between, so subjects have to memorize the scene for a subsequent memory test. And right, so all tasks showed an initial leftward bias, and here we see the results for the memorization in blue and the preference in red task. In both tasks, the scene was shown for 8 seconds, and what you see here is actually a model fit. So we fit a generalized additive, what was it, the generalized additive model to the individual fixation deviations, and you can think of this as being a fancy regression method. And you can then quantify this initial leftward bias with regard to its amplitude, so it's about 1 degree, and also its duration, so it lasts for about a second and a half. And with regard to the task effects, we can see that it's a little stronger for the memorization task, right? And this initial leftward bias was then followed by, possibly, compensatory rightward bias, which could simply reflect that viewers now explore previously unattended regions, and then, for the rest of the time, the viewing, the fixation pattern is then symmetric with slight oscillations. Right, so this was the focus of the study, the initial leftward bias. And now, what about the search task? And those are actually the data I like the most. So here we need to distinguish whether the target was located on the left or on the right side of the image. And also the trial durations were variable because search times were varied, and so we analyzed 3 seconds, which equated to the mean search time in the data. And those are the data for the scenes where the target is on the left side of the image. And what you see here is actually what you have to expect. It's almost trivial. It just means that, eventually, people arrive at the target. There is a negative deviation. And now, what happens for targets that are located on the right side of the image? And now I expect enthusiasm, because the results are quite striking. Subjects can't help it. So even though the target is on the right side, they show this student neglect, though if you compare it to the other tasks, it's attenuated, so it's only half a degree. It still lasts for 1 second. And then when I saw this, I was like, oh my god, does it mean we from now on have to always control whether the target is on the left or right side of the image? Does it have any effect on the performance, right? Because you may argue you're taking a little detour here, but that wasn't the case, at least not in our data. But this probably needs to be investigated in more detail.
So who were your participants? What was the age range?
Students.
Have you tested that on an aging population? Does an aging population show the same bias?
I don't know at this point. So this is really, there's now another paper from a German lab in Osnabrück, also investigating various aspects, but more scene-based aspects, so no population aspect. So what I can't answer your question right now, but that's interesting. That's an interesting fact to look at. Yeah. So you would assume from, I mean, there's vast literature on student neglect, so you can really drown in this, and you would assume that a few variables like the viewing distance would modulate the effect, so it should be a little larger, you know, the viewing distance is a little shorter. And yeah, so I can't remember whether with regard to other tasks with age.
Yeah, I once did a bit of work with Rob McIntosh on
Right, yeah.
neglect and stuff, and we looked at older controls and neglect patients for, was it where they had to locate the ends of the two lines on a touch screen task.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually on things. But actually the older people showed a rightward bias, the same as, but of a smaller magnitude.
Right.
So I just wondered if it changes as you get older.
No, I don't read it. And so what the other lab could identify was that handedness matters, which, you know, because, you know, typical, the explanation about student neglect refers to hemispheric differences. So they tested all sorts of things, but couldn't really, identify, for example, reading direction. So that's a question people always ask, you know, is it related to reading direction? But it's not, because this is how the collaboration started, because my friend and collaborator did a covert attention task where she also observed by varying SOAs, observed the leftward bias, which kind of excluded that it's like that it's introduced by the reading direction. And anyway, so if you put those two together, you see like a strong student neglect. And with regard to the explanation, so most accounts of student neglect focus on the advantage of the right hemisphere in directing spatial attention. So now the right hemisphere controls the left side of space, so we attend more to stimuli presented in the left hemispace. And that's not new, that's been known for a long time. And the novel aspect, in my view, from a theoretical point of view, are here the task effects. So, which we can summarize such that student neglect was more pronounced, larger in amplitude and longer in duration for tasks that involve more top-down control. And, you know, I didn't want to commit to any explanation, but the reviewers made us to, so my talented collaborator then suggested it's through an interaction between a bottom-up network, top-down network of visual attention, which I hope you don't mind us stating the details of. And also it actually requires neuroimaging work to verify. I mean, this is really a bit of a speculative point.
Can you give us the gist of it though? I mean, it's kind of interesting. You
I-
brought it up, I mean.
It's very difficult. I have an extra slide if you really want to know.
We can talk about it at the pub.
Yeah, that would be, I would have to find that because it's really, it's very elaborate, let's put it that way. So, I should not bring it up if I don't want that. So that was about the where, the objects briefly, and the student neglect as, you know, an example of spatial biases. And the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk briefly about the when, but not so much about modeling, but more about empirical work. And if you were at ECM last year, you will know that already. So,
Antje, can I ask you one more
Yeah,
question?
sure.
Student neglect? So in human face,
absolutely.
so maybe people in the room know this either, but in human faces also there's a slight preference for the left, looking on the left of the face.
Yeah.
Is this above and beyond student neglect?
No, that to me that would be the very same phenomenon. If it's an intentional phenomenon. That's what, you know, most theories I've read about converge to.
So the explanation I've read that people had more focus on the left side of the face because supposedly it would contain more information would be absolutely not true, because it would be just student neglect.
Why would there be more information on the left side?
That's what I've seen.
Was that some reason?
Yeah, the left side goes show more motion.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why people.
Yeah, see,
and
you're
it's
more
supposed
an
to be
expert on this than
more
I am.
attractive. Yeah. We have to just get them to look in the mirror, wouldn't we? And see which side.
Oh yeah,
they're
just
in.
mirror it and see whether or not it's not.
Yeah. Mirror
Why
the
this would be a
face.
simple question. Why would it be above and beyond student neglect?
I'm not sure if I believe in pseudo neglect yet.
But what is your explanation for
I don't know.
for those
Like,
effects?
you know, you would have to. I'm not sure.
So it's very stable. So with regard to scenes, that other lab has like a 19 pages paper in Journal of Vision where they looked at all all sorts of factors, and they just couldn't destroy it. So really, the only thing that modulated the effect or made it disappear was the handedness. If you were
Right.
left-handed.
Okay, maybe it's not pseudo-neglect, maybe it's
Yeah.
something else, right? Maybe it is a bias, right? It's a bias.
Exactly. Yeah.
but
So
maybe
I
it's
take
not
your point.
pseudo-neglect.
So Rob would say, "Oh, why did you call this pseudo-neglect?"
Yeah.
And I agree, but I tell you why. Because in scene perception, there's a lot of literature on spatial biases. Say the central bias, and leftward bias is already taken by. If you talk about the tendency to make more left-directed or right-directed saccades, which is a slightly different question because you could be on the left side of the image but still make a left or right saccade. So we went for this term to not kind of mix it up with the big literature on spatial biases in scene viewing. And also, yeah, it sounds catchier. That's spatial biases.
Actually, it's kind of related to Louise's work. We're already Louise, isn't it? Yeah. On frames of reference.
Right.
And whether you're looking at something in a global thing or whether you're fixating something small. So you could have your leftward bias there, which would be like a fixation-based leftward bias. Or you could have a global bias, which is like an object, you know, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And those frames of reference might operate differently for different tasks.
Right. So this would be the more a global bias.
Yeah.
Because I know from the neglect literature, the little I know there is that within, so the patients, they tend to the right? So within the right side, they actually have as many leftward than rightward saccades.
Not always.
No, well, that's the paper I read.
Okay, I don't think that that's
Yeah.
true. Sometimes they do. So it's
Yeah.
very complicated because sometimes they do make saccades to the left, but then they don't fixate there for very long.
Right.
Why? And sometimes they do make them to the left and they actually process something, but sometimes they don't, right?
Right.
And actually also is dependent, and Louise has just finished her thesis on neglect and eye movements, and it does depend on, you know, you can use the same stimulus, right, but get them to use a different frame of reference depending on what you're asking them to do, whether
Yeah.
you're asking them to encode the information or to
Right.
represent it. And then what you find is in one case they you see what we call egocentric neglect, global neglect from the midline,
Right.
and then the other one you see allocentric neglect. Louise, you should be saying this, not me, this is your word.
Yeah.
Which
so-
is where directly where they're looking at, wherever it is, right, then they're neglecting stuff.
right.
And it's fixation based. So we don't really think allocentric neglect is necessarily allocentric neglect
right.
as it has been. Right, I'm sorry, I'm shut.
Well, thanks for those points. No, it's really interesting because that project is actually, an eye tracking person and a neuropsychologist working together, and it worked quite nicely.
Yeah.
But certainly, I'm not so knowledgeable about it. It's advanced literature, right?
Yeah, it is.
On neglect and also even pseudo-neglect
Yeah.
or leftward bias. So, yeah. So thanks for this input. So, I should probably then hurry a little bit. So here, this is just a pointer to say that here we actually have some theoretical framework, and all I want to do in this talk is to briefly describe some core assumptions, and then I'm going to focus on an approach that attempted to provide a richer empirical basis for this type of modeling. So, fixation durations are defined as the time intervals between successive saccades. So, in that sense, the model simulates saccade programs or initiates saccade programs, and those are initiated by a random timer, which is here modeled as a random walk. And once it reaches the threshold, a new saccade program is initiated. It first enters a lay-by stage. I typically have Eric's 98 paper on this as well, because Eric's Easy Reader was the first model to implement this two-stage saccade programming logic in a computational model.
Actually, Morrison's model was.
Right, okay. So I think I kind of replace it with our double-step literature, but typically Eric is on this as well. So it's labeled, which means it can still be modified or even aborted, cancelled, and then a point of no return is reached, it turns non-labeled and will be executed. And importantly, that's not very kind of generally put, this random walk timing signal can be modulated by inhibition in the sense of processing difficulty, and there are two general mechanisms. So there are in red in the figure. So first of all, the processing demands can modulate or slow down, particularly with the random low transition rate here, which eventually will lead to longer fixation durations. And secondly, it can also cancel saccades, which will also result into longer fixation durations. But really, I want to focus on the basic idea, and that is that the durations of those fixations are sensitive to those moment-to-moment processing demands or task effects. So for example, we know that fixation durations are slightly shorter in visual search than in scene memorization. That's also something we've simulated. And on this slide, I listed a number of other factors, most of them, or all of them, low-level factors that have been shown to modulate fixation durations or affect fixation durations in scene viewing, including luminance, color, and spatial frequency information. And now the important point is that common to all of these and other experiments is that the entire scene was manipulated. So the luminance of the entire scene was reduced, for example. So to very global processing difficulty. And that's also the type of manipulation we model. So it's not really a scene processing model in that sense. And some of my recent work extends this line of research by investigating local effects of image features on durations. And specifically, I tested a set of what I would like to call low-level and higher-level or mid-level visual image features using a linear mixed effects modeling approach, which allows us to assess each predictor's unique contribution to explaining variance. And a secondary issue was again to the task effects, and I again used this big data set I was mentioning earlier, 72 people, 135 photographs, 3 tasks. And so in the interest of time, I just give you kind of the gist of how it works in principle. So in reading a task well you are familiar with, we can analyze how certain word characteristics influence fixation durations on words outside the length. And in analogy, we could analyze fixation durations on objects and scenes. And I know I've told you earlier in my talk how important objects are, and however, what then comes down to those analyses, what counts as an object in the context of real-world scenes is not always well defined. And so as an alternative for this particular approach, I put a circular patch around each fixation point and analyzed how certain image features within the patch influence the fixation duration. And patches had a radius of 1 degree, so approximating a little more than full vision. So this is how it looks if you apply it to one of our scenes. So that's the basket scene you've seen before. And we zoom into this part of the basket scene and then assume an imaginary fixation on the coffee mug, right? And as low-level image features, we examined 3 measures that characterize different properties of image luminance. So just quickly, you can actually separate the luminance information from the color information, and this is the resulting luminance map for our basket scene. And local luminance was now defined as the average value of the luminance within the patch, and greater luminance just means the higher degree of subjectively perceived brightness. So we can extend this to luminance contrast, and then we can also look at edges. So here, edges are defined as the boundaries between regions of different mean luminance, and this produces then a black and white map where the edges are, the white pixels, and so local edge density is then just the proportion of the white pixels in the patch, right? So those were kind of the low-level features, and then with regard to the mid-level or higher-level features, I used clutter. It's a measure of visual complexity, which has been studied in the context of scenes. So Ruth Rosenholz has offered a MATLAB toolbox to calculate, a measure of what she calls feature congestion of visual clutter, and that's what we used. And we then just use the mean of the image pixels within that patch again. And then my favorite one is mean shift segmentation. It's an old algorithm from computer vision. And so the goal of image segmentation is to break up the image into kind of meaningful chunks. And it kind of approximates the beginnings of an object-based representation. And so how this would be analyzed is just to count the number of kind of homogeneous regions here in this patch as an index of mean shift. And you can think of this as approximating kind of some semantic richness of the scene, something like that.
So those are the different color patches there
Yeah.
on the cup, so like the light tan, the dark tan,
Right, so if you compare it to the real image, so that would be one.
Okay.
And I mean, you can play with the parameters, so that kind of default setting will give you quite a lot of patches, like 2,000 per scene, but qualitatively it doesn't matter. So it's a real strong predictor of fixation duration. So the more homogeneous patches you have in a region, the more information rich it may be, and that predicts fixation durations quite well. So this is a summary of our maps. And most of the results, and I don't want to talk about this in too much detail, but so each panel is one feature, and then the different lines are again the different viewing tasks. We can see what we saw again. Storage has shorter durations, but there's no interaction with the other two tasks. The other two are very similar, but really the focus is on how or do the features modulate fixation duration. And with regard to luminance, we see there is a negative effect. So brighter fixation locations are associated with brighter fixation locations are associated with shorter fixation durations. And contrast is an interesting one, luminance contrast, I should say, because previous experimental work by my collaborator, Idaho has reported a null effect. And if we just plot the interpolator, we actually see a positive effect, longer durations for higher contrast. However, it's kind of a suppressor, a nasty suppressor effect. So in the model, it actually has a negative sign. So if you plot the linear mixed, the partial linear mixed effect of contrast, you see it's a relatively strong negative effect. We're currently trying to follow this up experimentally to kind of tease this apart, the effects of luminance and contrast, because Wolfgang is an expert on this stuff. So, and then just quickly go through this. As the number of edges in full field vision, increases, so does fixation duration. Clutter likewise, and here my beautiful graph for mean shift, a strong effect, right? It's the strongest predictor. So the more meaningful chunks there are around the current fixation location, the longer is the duration. But to sum this up, I mean, they all contribute, have a unique contribution above and beyond the others. So both the low level and the high level. And what I really wanted to do, and that's just a very quick excursion, is to look at, and that's, Dennis and Eric will see this is shamelessly borrowed from reading research, but I was the author on that paper, so I felt I have any right to do that. So what we've done so far is to establish immediacy effects of local image statistics on fixation durations. And now I've shown you at the beginning of my talk that the visual span is very large, and this is why I wanted to measure it, to find out how large it is with current equipment and my type of scenes. So the question arises as to whether there are also effects originating from the previous location or the next location. So we would call those spillover and peripheral phobia effects. Or put differently, is there distributed processing within the perceptual span or visual span? So I've tested this in a triplet analysis. The dependent variable is still the duration of the fixation n here, right? That's very important. It's always a dependent variable. And regarding the previous fixation location n minus 1, its difficulty may spill over to that fixation and thus then inflating this fixation duration. And also, regarding the next fixation location, n+1, the logic is that it may at least partially be processed in parafoveal vision, and this may affect the duration of the current fixation. And to test this, we calculate again the features for the patches, now for n-1, n+1, on top of n, and throw this all into the model. And so I required that those patches, didn't overlap. And I spent about 6 weeks of my precious sabbatical last year on those analyses, and it was really disappointing. And I can't find the motivation to write this up. So for search, there's no spillover effect, nothing, no spillover, no parafoveal and foveal, and I'm not sure why. Because maybe you have any ideas. And with regard to the other two tasks, experts on LMEs, knowing how many subjects and how many data points I have, will see this is just marginally significant. It doesn't mean anything. So it's.
Angela, did you look at fixation distance of the n-1 and n+1?
Yeah.
To see
So
if that has an effect?
this was actually grayed out. So I had a number of visual motor parameters that I also threw in, like the length of the incoming and outgoing saccade. And incoming saccade had an effect, quite a strong effect, right? And then, I played with the size of the patches and allowing them to be closer together and all sorts of things. But there's just, and then I looked at effects over time, because we know that fixation durations get longer over the course of viewing and scene viewing. And some idea was that they kick in later in viewing, but there was really nothing. So my take on this so far is I still believe it exists, it must exist, but I haven't found the right way of testing it yet. Because as I said earlier, I just try to adopt something of reading my analysis scheme and.
But why must it exist if in your first experiments you show there's a larger perceptual span in tasks like scene viewing? Maybe
Right,
there's
yeah.
so much parallelism going on that you really can't detect things like spillover or successor effects, right? Because whatever is going to be processed, or whatever was previously processed in the previous fixation is done, right?
Right.
You got such a parafoveal preview of it, and that in combination with the fixation on that location.
Yeah, so with regard to the spillover, I wouldn't have a problem to accept that they're not there, but the parafoveal and foveal I kind of would expect. And I also say this based on some other stuff I've done on object recognition. Or within the scene literature, there's this debate as to whether object in scene semantics and syntax can be detected in the paraphobia. So whether your eyes are drawn earlier to inconsistent regions, and it's a very inconsistent pattern of results. And then I was maybe scenes are just too complex. So I broke this down and I used objects only, and I created a situation where I must see those effects if they are there. And I put two objects really close to one another and let them view the two objects, and they were either semantically related or not. So it's a little slightly different take on semantics. And I observed those parafoveal and foveal effects. So it was, they were 5 degrees apart. So it was partially in central vision, partially in peripheral vision. So in this kind of very isolated and situation where I kind of maximized.
But that's also more analogous to reading in the sense you know exactly
Yeah,
where you
course,
need
yeah.
to move your eyes.
So maybe I just need to detach myself from thinking like a reading person and then just, yeah.
I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, that may be the solution to it, yeah. So there is not much on, the question as to whether processing is serial or in parallel it's in scene perception, it's pretty much an open question, right? So I think in one of our own papers, we refer to research on change blindness and stuff that you only detect it when you're really fixating on it or you're very close to it, and that kind of seems to propose it's more serial if you want, but there's not much that really speaks to this at this point. So it was just an idea, not all ideas turn into great results, but I mean, I think the immediacy effects are still interesting, right? So given that all the existing papers are pretty much looking at global effects and then do them in isolation, contrast here, luminance here, spatial frequency here, and that's sort of a contribution to show with, how with linear mixed effects models you can look at global effects, immediacy effects. I mean, this is a process of doing it well, but I can just forget about it, not report it over. But I wanted to share, because I knew that you would at least understand perhaps why I would look at that. So to sum this up, well, I've said all that already, and so that's kind of the big summary. And that's, the first one is actually quite important, I think, that findings obtained with highly artificial, and people who know me, I do work with simple simulating myself, and I love psychophysics, and I typically say at the end of my career I'm going to be a psychophysicist. So, but still, it's an important point that findings obtained with highly artificial search displays do not necessarily generalize from models of similar use. And then with regard to the where, new what I'm assuming like, which I'm not super expert on, I just know it. And then with regard to the when, the point is that, any viable model phase control and scene perception, and they all, speak to the where, but not the when, but they should not be more when. And take this into account as well. And so those are the people I've been working with, simulated fixation missions, and my students. And much of it was actually done during my sabbatical. So thanks very much.
Can you go back to the suppressor effect?
Oh, the suppressor.
Yeah, okay. So for people in the room will not know what a suppressor effect is well. So
Then you explain it to them.
Suppressor effect is basically where your module.
Let me give you a start, right?
Yeah, go
so
for it.
when I only put in luminance,
Yeah.
but not contrast, and I put in the other ones. The other one. If I would put in contrast but not luminance, it's positive.
Yeah.
As if I would see it in the input layer. As soon as I put in luminance, it turns sign. And now you explain to your students why this is what is.
Oh, so my question was going to be, I would have said the same thing, basically. It's just
Right.
that just where you have something very weird where something flips sign,
And
when
then
you add something else to your
unfortunately,
model.
as a researcher, we need to find out what's causing this. And I mean, so I remember that in the reading stuff, my former supervisor, I always did like, you always found out, we had suppressor effects with regard to word length, and we could disentangle them. But I couldn't, so we now started running experiments where we manipulated luminance and contrast independently.
So my question was going to be, for that suppressor effect, to the next slide.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at contrast. So if contrast goes up, fixation time goes down.
I think intuitively you can accept, I would buy into both. So high contrast, good quality, you stay longer.
Yeah.
High contrast, easier to process, you stay shorter. So,
Mhm.
but really, there's only one study that has looked at that, and also as a only as a side effect is Wolfgang Einhorn's study, and he had no effect. But he only did like a simple first order correlation with a few data points. So there's just very little on fixation ratios.
So it could be that with reduced contrast, it takes you longer to look at it, but on the other hand, with very high contrast, there's just more information together, so you're going to stay there longer too, so it could be.
Yeah, well, what content-wise we need to find out, it's luminance contrast, how the two play together, and we haven't, Wolfgang is the expert on that and all that stuff, and he didn't have an easy explanation, that's why we started running an experiment, we're still finishing a production. Because he's a psychophysicist, so I need to explain to him that 6 subject is very little to look at those effects, so we have 12. So my next step is, 12 is still very little, so it just takes some time to get enough data. Yeah.
Other questions?
Could we go go back to the lag and successor effects and seeing, or the absence of the effects?
Yeah.
So it strikes me, one possible explanation is that in reading, the direction of the eyes, where they're moving, and the shifts of attention are very tightly coupled, right? There's no uncertainty about where you're going to move the eyes next, or where you're going to move attention next, because you're going down the line.
Yeah.
But in scene viewing, maybe there's more of a decoupling in the sense that there's more uncertainty up until the very last minute, the last millisecond, where you're going to move your eyes next. And so if you think about having attention diffusely allocated across, three-dimensional or two-dimensional space, and at the last second or last instant you're deciding where to move the eyes next, attention's not already there, so you're not going to pick up the parafoveal processing or whatever you're moving your eyes to.
Yeah. So that's a very good possibility. I mean, if you buy into this, imagine. Even though we know from the biases research that most saccades are actually horizontal in scene viewing, and also there's something like saccadic momentum, and that's also was one of the predictors, but I didn't want to make the story overly complicated. So it means if you're staying on your current trajectory, this will produce the shortest fixation durations. So a change in trajectory will prolong your fixation duration. So this is actually the strongest predictor of all. But your suggestion is, it's a very good point, because if you think about it, if you have this large span, and then, as you say, you have to analyze, basically, a lot of regions for a potential target candidate, especially in search, to locate. So that's something I can understand better, why there's nothing in search. And then that this may be a reason why the location you eventually choose does not show, that the peripheral processing of that location doesn't show in that fixation region. That's what I actually was meaning when I said maybe I hadn't gotten the best method to get at this yet.
You could play
Because
with
this is really the logic. The logic says it must show in that fixation duration, but maybe that's just not the best way of getting at it. Or as you say, maybe it doesn't play such an important role. It doesn't.
maybe you could manipulate the probability of targets in different locations. You might have to use a simpler task, more like a standard visual search task.
Right. So that has been done. So one could really analyze such
Right.
data, and so that you kind of limit the
range of possibilities
Yeah.
where we're going to.
That's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, thanks.
Could you average n minus 2, n minus 3, n minus 4 to see if it occurs in a range on average? In
Yeah,
case.
I haven't looked at that yet. The only thing I've done is I looked at difference values, because trying to detach myself from thinking like a reader and a reading person. So I was like, it's not quite as reading, because the luminance changes, but actually maybe it's the difference that matters, right? You come from a very low luminance region, then it goes up. So, but it's actually look at the difference that matters. And of course, if so those are significant predictors. If I put in the difference, right, that difference, like the difference in luminance, say, and the difference in luminance, they're fine. But if I then add those absolute values on top, they're gone again. And then I'm not really sure what do the differences then mean. You know what I mean? So I could base my argument on the two differences, but does that then really speak to the question I wanted to ask originally? So but thanks for thinking about it. So it's interesting but not straightforward.
Sorry, I'm going to take you back to pseudo-neglect.
Sure.
I just was wondering if you could elaborate on the top-down effect that you got that exacerbated the pseudo-neglect, because we've actually found a kind of similar effect for neglect in terms of not only did we find that task demands affected the frame of reference that we're operating, as Val was talking about, we also found that the certain top-down and bottom-up factors affected the extent of information that was neglected.
Right.
So I'm just wondering about the top-down effect that you found that made pseudo-neglect more
Yeah.
pronounced.
So you basically want me to explain. unfortunately all put together from various presentation ways. So, I mean, first of all, with regard to the data, it was very much descriptive, right? So we had the 3 different viewing tasks, and admittedly it was a bit post hoc, right? So we had the 3 tasks.
Yeah.
We found that the amplitude and the duration seemed to depend on the task. And also, I mean, you can only compare the memorization and the preference directly, because in those 2 tasks, you know, the viewing time was constant, it was 8 seconds. And then the student neglect, and those were the same scenes rotated across tasks and subjects, so it was a nice design controlling for individual differences in scene effects. So in the memorization task, where we kind of post hoc then argued, you know, there's more top-down control involved, because I make you focus on, say, objects more, the effect was stronger, so the amplitude was larger and then it lasted for longer. And then in the search, as you can imagine, you can't fully really compare it to the other 2 tasks, but if you remember that curve, when I put the 2, you know, left and right side targets together, you know, the amplitude was larger and the duration was really long. So, I mean, so tentatively, one could argue, you know, the task with the highest top-down control or produces the largest pseudonym effect. And then, I mean, that's really painful, I have to say. So that is now the explanation my friend and co-author came up with. So it's related to a model by Corbetta and Schulman, which I'm sure you guys know better than I do. So, and it's proposing a top-down network, which is bilateral, and a bottom-up network, which is right-lateralized. And yeah, and what they propose in their paper is that there's an interaction between the 2 networks. So these IPs here, the interparietal sulcus, so the top-down network provides the bottom-up one with task-relevant information, and we kind of just took that and tried to apply this to our situation, and it is speculative. So arguing that tasks provoking more top-down control, or you know, you can think of those as showing a stronger engagement of the top-down network, and a stronger, and that's actually the catch here, and a stronger functional interaction between the 2. So you would observe, first of all, the enhanced activation of the right lateralized bottom-up network, but likewise, an even stronger over-orienting towards the left hemispace. So it's quite tricky. It's actually through this interaction of those 2 networks that you would then kind of be able to argue that the task with the higher top-down control would show a stronger effect.
But that wouldn't be able to explain the same effect in neglect.
So you would
That wouldn't be able to necessarily explain the same effect within actual neglect.
You would not.
No.
So how would you explain it in neglect?
That's what I'm wondering whether that explanation can explain it happening.
Oh, I'm afraid I know nothing about neglect. That's really, that's, you know, interdisciplinary science if you want.
Because it's the opposite side of space,
Yeah.
that's what I'm wondering.
So yeah, I know that there are lots of theories, and that the pseudonym theories are kind of related to the explanations on the neglect, but yeah, no, I don't want to speak to this, because I'm not an expert on this. It would possibly certainly be wrong, everything I would say.
Maybe you could do a TMS study on all those regions and see if you can wipe out.
I mean, in all seriousness, we concluded in the paper, I mean, we can't say for sure based on our data. It requires neuroimaging work, and then I visited the lab in Salzburg. They were quite enthusiastic about it because they found a way of doing some sort of fixation contingent, fMRI and stuff like that. So and they also suggested one could even do it with EG and certain sophisticated analysis techniques. our data we just can't see, right? So it's just an explanation or a proposal at this point.